Mm. Namaste. A very warm welcome to the session. The title of today's talk is Vegetarian Diets, Health Benefits and Risks. Our guest speaker is Dr. Vinaya Simha. Vinaya Simha, MBBS MD, is a consultant in the Division of Endocrinology at Mayo Clinic in Rochester and holds the rank of Associate Professor of Medicine, Mayo Clinic College of Medicine and Science. He has served as chair of the Mayo Clinic Hospital Diabetes Oversight Group and is a member of the National Lipid Association, Endocrine Society, American Diabetes Association, American Association of Clinical Endocrinologists, and Association of Physiologists and Pharmacologists of India. Dr. Simha's areas of practice include diabetes and lipid disorders, and his research interests are in lipodystrophy and disorders of body fat distribution. Vinessa, welcome to the Yes platform. We are so grateful that you have joined us today. Thanks so much. Look forward to an interesting session with you. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Arunima. Thanks. Greetings to everybody. I'm not sure whether you can actually see me. At least on my end, I can only see a blank screen. But anyway, I think it's more important you see my slides. So let me pull that up. I think you can see my slides, I think.
Yes, sir. The slides are visible. If you're comfortable, you can make it full screen also. If at all.
Yes, that's what I'm trying to do. Is this better?
Yes, it's full screen now, sir. Perfect. Thanks.
All right. Okay. Well, good evening and thank you again. It is great to be seeing Dr. Bijlani again. It was, I still have all my friends and relatives here who, every time I run into them, they still have these very fond reminiscences of Dr. Bijlani's brief visit to us and how much he has inspired all of us during that brief visit. So once again, it's great to see you again, Dr. Bijlani. Very good. So actually, Dr. Bijlani, when he was here, wanted me to speak on, well, his initial advice was for me to speak on, we were just chatting, and then I happened to mention one of Shankara's verses, and then this was on the Brahman and Jiva and so on. And then he kindly suggested that maybe I should speak on that. And then, of course, there is no way I'm up to a task like that. So I stuck to something that is way more mundane. So thank you again for indulging me. So what I will be speaking today is on vegetarian diets, and this will mainly be on the health benefits and risks of vegetarian diets. It is customary to always begin a talk by first laying out the, one is the objectives, but the objectives are clear enough, and also the disclosures. Okay, so these are my disclosures. And so while this is a very complex topic, and so but obviously I'm a very simple-minded person. I'm just a simple clinician. So Sri Ramakrishna would always joke about doctors, that they seem high sounding, but their mind is always just on fluids, on vomit and feces and urine and so on. So this is very physical. So on a very spiritual platform, so I still will be doing very physical, mundane things. And there is one more thing that I think we should know right off the bat. So about in terms of biases. So I am a vegetarian myself. So when I was young, I still remember I grew up with, this is one of the verses. I could never find this on Google. So therefore I had to write it out by hand. So I don't know how well I have written it, but this is so well ingrained into my own memory. So this is a verse that I'm not sure who actually wrote it. They say it is either Sri Ramanuja or probably one of his disciples. So it says, Swachanda vanajatena shakhenapi prapuryate asya dagdhodarasyarte kah kuryat patakam mahat. So like this earth is abound with swachanda vanajata, like, all these forests which have just grown up on their own, and shake napi, and all these trees, and like there is so much abundant vegetation in this earth. And then asya dagdhodarasyarte. But for this wretched stomach, who would want to do kah kuryat patakam mahat, the great sin of killing an animal? So this is like one of the ways in which people have been approaching this subject. So yes, so I have those biases too. So right off the bat, I will tell you my twin faults, so to say. I'm biased, and then I have my interests are very much physical. So with these biases, let me just tell you what I think about the vegetarianism, which rather vegetarian diets. So we'll start with some historical perspectives. So there's something very interesting that some people make out, and that is about what the um, the the anthropologists actually feel that our ancestors were always vegetarian. This is like prehistorical times. So like people before the more like the anthropoids, like before Homo sapiens, the Homo erectus and others. And that's because if you look at the way our body structure is, mainly our teeth. So we mainly have flat teeth, and then the way our jaws are wired, or rather they are built. So the our jaws can move side to side, unlike say the carnivores. So they just have these sharp teeth, and then they're hinged such that there is only vertical movement of their jaws. So if you see all the dogs and cats and so on, whereas we are actually built very differently. So we are mainly meant for mastication, so for grinding and chewing rather than just staring and swallowing. Also, the long intestines that we have. So, our intestines are relatively much longer than the carnivores. And this probably is because we are meant to actually have a longer process of digestion and fermentation and other things that go on, as opposed to early elimination of toxins that happens if you're primarily a carnivore. So, there are many anthropologists who believe that we were mainly designed to be herbivores. But nonetheless, they also feel that it was our ability to adapt to an omnivorous diet that has given us some survival advantage. But at least the prehistorical men, probably they ate mostly plant-based foods, maybe a few insects and larvae. That's what some anthropological evidence suggests. So that's what we did. But then that was more out of necessity. The earliest evidence we have, historical evidence we have about somebody opting for a vegetarian diet is probably in ancient Egypt. So there are some records available from as far back as 3200 BC, where this voluntary abstainment from meat eating, and they believed that that would facilitate reincarnation. So this was one of the earliest instances of people actually opting for a vegetarian diet. Um, well, the reasons, of course, as you can see, are who knows, are rather debatable. But then much of the vegetarianism probably received a fillip from India. Even now, if you actually see the overall prevalence of vegetarianism is way higher in India than any other place. So, like if you look across the continents, so Asia probably has the highest. About 19% of people in Asia, they identify themselves as vegetarians, whereas across the other continents, it's much less, way less than 10%. So in the US, I think it's about 5%, Europe is 5 to 6%, and so on. And I think I think Europe is probably around 10%. South America is about 5 to 6%. So, whereas in India, it's about 40%. So, 40% of the people are vegetarians. Again, I won't go into all the nuances and intricacies about vegetarianism in India. So you must have heard this debate many times over. So where did this really originate? So like in the Vedic times, there is not such a great emphasis on vegetarianism. There is still a lot of emphasis on sattvic foods and the importance of food and mind and other things. Not very advanced spirituality, but then at least for a sadhaka, So there is all this mention of what is an appropriate food and so on. But then there is very little um, clear guidelines on vegetarianism versus animal-based foods. But then perhaps with the advent of Buddhism and Jainism, this received a greater fillip. And I think that again was more a reaction to the rampant animal sacrifices that were probably happening. So between the Vedic thoughts and then the Buddha's, I don't know whether Buddha uh, actually started ahimsa. I think there was ahimsa even before, but then I think he focused more on this rather than more esoteric Vedic principles. And so between those different cultures that stemmed out in India, so I think vegetarianism probably flourished in India and has been flourishing in India more than any other parts of the world. And then actually, mainly in the sense that it seems to be mainstream vegetarianism in India, but then elsewhere, there were always these strong votaries for vegetarianism. So amongst ancient Greek philosophers, so Plato and Pythagoras. In fact, this was called the Pythagorean diet. So I did not know that. So vegetarian diet for long was actually recognized as the Pythagorean diet. So he was a strong votary for vegetarianism. Leonardo da Vinci, I'm told, was again he strongly believed and wrote that killing an animal is the same as killing a human being, and he was a votary for vegetarianism. And then in the Middle Ages, there was really otherwise not much emphasis on vegetarianism till Darwinism. So I think with Darwinism, then there was a so people, till then, the church actually had people believe that animals were there for the enjoyment of human beings. And so it was quite okay. There is nothing immoral about killing an animal for food. But I think with Darwinism and with evolution, there was some rethink, and then there was the birth of the vegetarian societies in Europe. Of course, you can never speak about the history of vegetarianism without acknowledging the contribution of Mahatma Gandhi. I don't know whether it is so much for Indians, but then at least for the West, his message about ahimsa and vegetarianism, I think it made a big impact. Albert Einstein has been quoted as having said about how an evolved society will necessarily have to be vegetarian. But then, you should always take it with a pinch of salt about what all Albert Einstein has said. So who knows which he actually said and what other people have made him to have said. So, but overall, you see that there has always been this, I don't know, this rankle about killing animals for food. And many intellectual people have taken a stand against it. But then again, what I'm going to be mostly speaking about is the health considerations. And this is what has now kind of fueled the renewed enthusiasm about plant-based diets. So how beneficial it is to people's health and to the planet's health. So that is mostly what I will be talking about. So what are the demonstrated health benefits of vegetarian diets? I think one of the most clear benefits we have is in terms of lipid lowering. Now, of course, this is what I deal with every day. So this is my bread and butter. I deal with people with high cholesterol, high triglycerides, high sugar. So maybe that's why I'm talking about it. But then also, no, there is actually very good data showing that a plant-based diet is very beneficial for lowering cholesterol. So if you know that one of the workhorses that doctors use for lowering cholesterol and lowering cardiovascular disease is this group of medications called statins. And you would have heard them in various contexts. It's good, but then it also has a lot of side effects. There are many studies which have shown that adoption of a plant-based diet is almost as good as most moderate intensity statins. So it causes about a 30% reduction in bad or LDL cholesterol. So we know that they are very good, and there are lots of reasons why this might be good. Invariably, compared to a classical traditional Western diet, a plant-based diet involves decreased intake of saturated fat, which we know contributes to high cholesterol. It's not simply because there is low cholesterol in the diet. In fact, there is little evidence to show that increasing cholesterol content in the diet actually increases blood cholesterol levels itself. Like, there is all of this fascinating data about eggs. Like most people can tolerate eating eggs without actually increasing their cholesterol, except some people who are hyper responders and so on. But in general, if you eat a vegetarian diet, you will be taking less amount of fat, not just cholesterol, and that is very beneficial. More important is this increased intake of dietary fiber and something called phytosterols. Everybody thinks that cholesterol is a bad word. Cholesterol is not. Cholesterol is one of the most important molecules in the body. Every single cell requires cholesterol. So it is the basic building block of the cell wall, the cell membrane, many other organelles, and so on. And a similar molecule in plants are what are called phytosterols. And these phytosterols actually, so when we eat a plant-based diet, especially nuts and other seeds, so there's a lot of phytosterols. These phytosterols will then compete with cholesterol for absorption. There's also a lot of recirculation that happens in the body between the gut and the liver and so on. So end of the day, there is competition between the regular cholesterol and the phytosterols. So if you have a lot of phytosterols, then you will have less of the circulating cholesterol, less of the body cholesterol. And so that's one of the main reasons how a plant-based diet is able to lower lipids. So this is one of the well-demonstrated benefits of a vegetarian diet. Similarly, about glucose lowering, and again, this could partly be because of caloric restriction. So even though vegetarians don't necessarily try to decrease their caloric intake, it's just that the caloric density of vegetarian foods is so much less. So there is way more fiber, there is way more now fluid water content in the vegetarian foods compared to the animal-based foods. So there will necessarily be a decreased caloric intake, promoting weight loss, which is the most important thing for glucose control. The high fiber intake, we think, will also change the glycemic index of foods, which improves the postprandial glucose excursions. So there are a lot of reasons why plant-based foods are probably going to be beneficial for glucose lowering as well. Similarly, for high blood pressure, and nowadays there's a lot of interest on what it does to inflammation, oxidative stress, and modulation of the gut microbiome. So, yeah, so this is a very interesting thing. So, those of you who have been following this, so I mean, I think there are many people who have spoken on this platform about the fallacy of identifying ourselves, what is the self. Okay, so we seem to think that the self is our body and our mind and so on. So again, right off the bat, I acknowledge my limitations on this, but here's my 1 cent on this. So we always seem to think that our self is yeah. I mean, we know that the self is something different, but then even at least the body, we seem to think that, oh, this is my body, is mine. But for every single cell that we generally identify as mine, there are probably at least 10 which are not really truly mine. Like they don't have my genes, they don't have the Homo sapien genes at all. So there is so much of the microbiome in us. So there's like the enormous number of intestinal species that we have. So like we are only a tenth of what we actually feed and what probably regulates our metabolism and so on. So there is this gut microbiome, and there is fascinating data on how the diet influences the composition of this and how the composition of the microbiome then influences our own metabolic functions and so on. So vegetarian diets probably have some influence on this. So here's a pictorial depiction of potential mechanistic benefits of healthy plant-based diets. So primarily, as I told you, so there is less saturated fat and trans fats in these plant-based diets. There is more dietary fiber. And this is what I was talking about, the microbiome. So these microbiomes, so when we eat a plant-based diet, then these small microbes that are there, they will make more of the short chain fatty acids, as opposed to if you were actually eating mainly animal-based diets, which are rich in this carnitine and choline, then these bugs actually make a lot of this very pro-inflammatory molecule called TMAO. And all of this coupled with the decreased energy density, more phytonutrients, and so on, lead to low cholesterol, decreased central adiposity, decreased inflammation, decreased release of something called IGF-1. And we think that this is a growth promoting a hormone which probably in some ways it promotes cancer, tumor genesis. So that's one of the reasons why there is less cancer that we see in plant-based diet. And this decreased inflammation, decreased insulin resistance, decreased adiposity is what is responsible for the lower incidence of all of these non-communicable diseases, coronary heart disease, heart failure, and so on and so forth. So these are some of the potential mechanistic benefits of eating a vegetarian diet. Now, all of this is, you might say, oh, this is all just armchair speculation. So what is the actual real data in terms of the benefits of vegetarian diets? Much of what we have are is actually cross-sectional studies. And, cross-sectional studies are only, they're association studies. So who knows whether it is, they are the ones which are truly responsible for all the changes that we see. It might just be that, people who are sick or people who are, people who are already healthy are uh, opting for vegetarian diets, people who are more educated, people who are more well off, at least in the Western societies, those are the ones who, and again, this is a real shame. Much of this data actually comes from the West on the benefits or on the benefits and risks of vegetarian diets. But then probably one of the largest longitudinal studies where people have followed people who either follow a vegetarian diet or an omnivorous diet have been followed longitudinally for decades together. As one of them is this EPIC Oxford study. So the EPIC Oxford study is the European prospective investigation into cancer and nutrition. And then the data from this was combined with the Oxford vegetarian study, which is on a smaller study, but on similar lines. So this was started way back in the 1990s. And then, so these are self-identified either vegetarians or vegans and the omnivores. And then they also combine this with a larger UK biobank database. So that has like about 1 million people. And then out of which a few thousand people identify themselves as vegetarians and a few hundred as vegans. So they have got all these data together, and then they have tried to look at the health outcomes between those who are vegetarians and those who are omnivores. Before we go into the actual outcomes, so these are the salient nutrient findings. So the self-identified vegetarians have a lower protein and saturated fat intake, a higher fiber intake. And in terms of actual food groups, they have a higher intake of soy, legumes, nuts, unprocessed cereals, lower vitamin. And unfortunately, these are all the good things. But then the bad things is they have lower vitamin B12, calcium, and iodine. Salient clinical and laboratory data was they had a lower BMI, lower body weight, blood pressure was lower, they had lower LDL cholesterol. So these are some of the findings which were very clear in terms of the basic differences between the two groups. What about the actual clinical data? So one way of looking at it is, so we look at the hazards. This is the hazards ratio. I assume some of you are not really, you have the luxury of not having to deal with things like this, but then this is typically what doctors look at. So they look at the hazard of having an event compared to somebody, hazard of a person who is on a vegetarian diet versus those who is not on a vegetarian diet in this condition. So if the two diets did not have any difference, then, the ratio would be same. It's like flipping a coin. Then the hazard ratio is the same. It would be 1. So if you find that this is actually on this side, on the right, that means it's more than 1. So then they would have a higher risk, and here this would be a lower. So if you see, the most important one is ischemic heart disease. So these are like heart attacks. So the heart attack, so there is the hazard ratio is 0.77, which means that there is a 23% lower risk of having a heart attack if you were on a vegetarian diet compared to an omnivorous diet. So that's very good. And you can see all the other good things. So diabetes. So diabetes seems to be way less, 35% lower risk of diabetes. Interestingly, then they tried to adjust this for the lower BMI. And as you can see, then it's much less. It's only about 11%. So it seems to be that at least some of the benefit of a vegetarian diet is that these people were also having a lesser body weight. And similarly, cancer, as you can see, cancer, this is a lower risk, especially stomach cancers, hematological cancers, so they seem to have a lower risk for this. Diverticular disease, kidney stones, cataract. So these are all the conditions where we see a lower risk in people who are on a vegetarian diet. But then it also showed that they were at higher risk for some other conditions. And one of them is this. This is intriguing, hemorrhagic stroke. You can get a stroke. Stroke is basically where the brain has less blood supply. The most common cause for this is you get a clot in the blood supplying to the brain. That's what we call ischemic strokes. While most conditions, are actually because of that. Heart attacks and the regular stroke are reduced. You can also get a brain bleed. That's what a hemorrhagic stroke is. For some reason, we just don't understand why it is. But then this is not just in the EPIC Oxford study. There's also an Australian study which showed this. Vegetarians seem to have a higher risk of hemorrhagic strokes. This probably is just a random thing. Nobody understands why. You can see again, if there's a big line here, it probably means there's a high confidence interval. So it might just have to do with the fallacy of the measurement. So I don't think we know much about that. Fracture. So hip fractures are higher. These are the two major things that we probably seem to, gallstones also. So gallstones, people who lose weight seem to have changes in their bile composition. So maybe that's understandable. But then hip fracture and hemorrhagic strokes is something that seems to be at a higher risk in people who are on a vegetarian diet. Now, one of the other good pieces of data we have is from studying the sect called the Seventh-day Adventists. I don't know how many of you are aware of this. So this is a Protestant sect in the US. So they are they are in some ways mainstream, in some ways they have their own beliefs and so on. And so they very strongly believe in the second coming of the Christ and so on. But they're usually very affluent people. And one of their emphasis is on a vegetarian diet. So there is a strong emphasis on vegetarian diets. And then they seem to do extremely well in terms of their health outcomes. So you might have heard of these things called the blue zones. So the blue zones are where people live for a very long time. So these longevity and like there's a small place in Italy, Sardinia, Japan, so on. One of the other blue zones is Loma Linda in California. And people think that that's a blue zone because there's a lot of these Seventh-day Adventists there. And so Loma Linda Institution is actually run by the Seventh-day Adventists. And so they have been doing the Adventist 2 studies, so looking at why the Seventh-day Adventists seem to do extremely well in terms of health outcomes. And as I told you, there is a big emphasis on vegetarian diets, but then it's not that everybody there is vegetarian. About 50% of them are vegetarians. And they have compared the outcome of vegetarian Seventh-day Adventists with the others who are omnivorous. And they have shown a lower risk of hypertension, lower risk of diabetes, and you can see the actual numbers anywhere between 50 to 60%, depending on whether they are completely vegan versus semi-vegetarian versus lacto-ovo-vegetarian. There's a lower risk of cardiovascular disease, and there's a 34% reduction in CHD mortality. And this was the Adventist 2 study, which is a much celebrated study. But then when they tried to parse this study, it is very interesting. They found that this was only limited, the benefit was limited to, it was not just about eating a vegetarian diet. They were also non-smokers who exercised regularly and who had very strong social connections, strong religious beliefs, and so on. So it's not just what we eat. It's probably vegetarianism as a lifestyle probably conferred greater benefit than just simply the actual food that was taken in the study. They had lower cancer risk, especially the vegans, and they make they make a big deal about about dairy. So dairy actually having increasing IGF-1 levels and so on. So Much of the benefit in terms of lower risk of breast and prostate cancer was seen mainly in the vegans. So overall, yes. So the Seventh-day Adventists, again, studies in them have shown that vegetarian diet is probably one of the important contributors to their longevity. Once again, what are the potential health risks? So I already mentioned this, so hemorrhagic stroke. So this is something that has puzzled people. We don't know the cause. One of the potential mechanisms may be because vitamin B12. So vitamin B12 is exclusively found in animal sources. So plants don't actually make vitamin B12. So if you're a vegan, then your B12 levels are going to be low. And as a consequence of that, there is increased level of this very inflammatory molecule called homocysteine. So some people have speculated that perhaps it's the elevated homocysteine that we see in vegans, which may be responsible. And a very low cholesterol also is sometimes not a good thing. So maybe it has something to do with the cellular integrity of the vessels that predisposes it to bleeding. We have seen this even in people who are on high intensity statin therapy and have very low cholesterol level. Having a very low cholesterol level decreases your risk of ischemic strokes, of myocardial infarction, overall death, and all of these other bad things, but not of hemorrhagic strokes. So sometimes too much of a good thing is not a good thing. So we just simply don't know. But these are the potential mechanisms and why there may be a higher risk of hemorrhagic strokes. Or for all we know, maybe this was just a statistical fluke. We never really have randomized controlled trials, which is kind of almost impossible to do on a long term with diet. So, but this is a finding. Fractures, of course, seems to be, I think that is something we can understand, partly because vegetarians seem to have a lower body weight, a lower BMI. And while being obese is bad for everything, it's good for one thing, and that is the bone health. So carrying a greater weight seems to keep our skeleton stronger. So losing weight is good for most other things except for bone health. And so perhaps that is one of the important things. More importantly, they also have a lower intake of calcium, especially if they don't take dairy products as well, and the lower protein intake. So both of these will contribute to a weaker bones. So that's probably why we see this. I already alluded to the micronutrient deficiencies, vitamin B12. The others that people are concerned about is iron, iodine, zinc. These can also happen. And primarily, this would happen if one is on an extremely restrictive diet. So most people should not get it as long as they also have some sprouted the sprouts actually have a high amount of vitamin B12. So it is not that all vegetarians or even vegans are doomed. So, and that they need to take a multivitamin supplement or so on. Maybe there are some people who need it, but then, especially if you also have even a reasonable amount of dairy intake along with the plant-based foods, it should be easy to avoid most of these mineral deficiencies. There are some Australian studies which suggested that maybe there is a higher incidence of depression in people who are on a vegetarian diet. I think there are a lot of fallacies to that study, so which is why I have these two query marks. So it's a cross-sectional study, and we don't know whether it is reverse causation. So people who are depressed are trying to experiment with new foods or something. We don't see that in the other longitudinal studies like the EPIC Norfolk. More importantly, I mentioned about the risks. I don't think that those are big. I don't think that there are great risks to health when you adopt a vegetarian diet. But I think there is a great risk that we sometimes see in thinking that vegetarian diet means a healthy diet. That is not necessarily true. Unfortunately, that's not necessarily true in the Indian context in many ways. All my relatives are vegetarians, okay, but then they abhor the idea of eating meat. But then, the amount of diabetes and other things that I see is like quite enormous. And that's because a vegetarian diet, we are mainly grainarian diet rather than a vegetarian diet in some ways. So a healthy vegetarian diet, this is what it should consist of. Lots of vegetables, fruits, whole grains, legumes, nuts, seeds, and perhaps low-fat dairy and eggs. So this would be a healthy vegetarian diet. And when you stick to that, then you will see all of these beneficial effects. Because of the fibers, vitamins, you'll see improved cardiometabolic profile, LDL cholesterol, A1C, body weight, and so on. Now, these are also vegetarian. Okay, so if you have fries and burgers and all of these things, I mean, this is a Western publication, but then I'm sure you can think of all the Indian equivalents as well. I have, um, I've seen so many of my relatives who actually feel that, oh, we eat such a healthy diet. We just eat rice and rasam. Okay, so this pure white rice and the thin rasam is, I mean, it's very tasty and all of those things. But then that is not necessarily the healthiest vegetarian diet. So if you have a diet that is very rich in refined carbs, sweet, sugar sweetened beverages, and then also, you can get lots of vegetarian pizza with vegetarian ultra processed foods and cookies and cakes, and all of these are vegetarian too. That doesn't necessarily mean that they are healthy. So just the label of being a vegetarian doesn't necessarily mean that you're eating healthy. And these foods we know are quite bad. Okay? So these unhealthy vegetarian diets, which are high in refined carbohydrates, high fructose corn syrup. So sugar is vegetarian too, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it is good. So they can promote exactly the opposite of all that we aim for: hyperglycemia, hyperinsulinemia. We know that high fructose corn syrup is really one of the metabolic poisons. So, and in some ways, actually, especially Asian Indians, so we know that they have a higher expression of a very, so there is this, there's a transcription factor. Okay, so like this is a signal to the liver to start making a lot of fat. And so this has been studied in Asian Indians, it's been studied in Hispanics. So when we eat a high carbohydrate diet, it's not just that our sugar goes up, but then we also make a lot of fat in our liver. We get fatty liver, which probably contributes to our high triglycerides and so on. So eating unhealthy carbs is probably not a good thing. Now, this is something I just wanted to touch on: sports performance. So, if you have actually read Mahatma Gandhi's Experiments in Truth, so there are all those chapters about him eating meat. So Gandhi actually started eating meat not because he thought that it was tasty or anything. He felt that it would make you stronger. And so he thought that the Britishers and the Mohammedans were stronger and were ruling us because they ate meat. And so this is one of the myths that we have, that we need to that this high protein that is there in animal foods is necessary for athletic performance and so on. So I still remember there was this Indian fast bowler from Karnataka who, he shot into prominence. But then, when he was on a foreign tour, he could not get enough vegetarian food, and they thought that's why he's not performing well. Okay, but of course, that all of that is not true at all. We now have probably India's best batsman, Kohli, who actually became a vegetarian and is doing better. Lots of other sports luminaries, I think. Nadal is one of the famous tennis players who is a vegetarian and so on. But those are isolated anecdotes. What about the actual data that we have? So this is a very nice paper. So this is a meta-analysis of all the elite athletes. And then they have looked at the sports performance of these athletes, of vegetarians comparing omnivores. So this is men and this is women. So essentially, one of the best indicators of your overall physical fitness is this thing called VO2 max. So that's the maximum amount of oxygen you can consume, which is like an integrated measure of your cardiorespiratory status and so on. So the long and short is there is no difference. So in fact, if anything, it almost looks like the vegetarian men and vegetarian women seem to have a better VO2 max, at least in this small subgroup. No, but there was no statistically significant difference. But the idea was to show that there is no difference. So like there is no reason for somebody to opt for animal-based proteins or an animal-based diet only to improve their physical performance. So they looked at different things, muscle power, sprint test. The body composition was not any different. It's not that they had a higher lean body mass, even though they had a higher carbohydrate intake and less fat intake. So there is no reason for anybody to opt for a non-vegetarian diet only to improve their athletic performance. People have looked at quality of life. This is one of the papers I found. So where this kind of summarizes uh, on different domains. So how adoption of a vegetarianism of a mainly plant-based diet would have both positive and negative influences on the physical domain, on the social domain, on psychological domain, on the environmental domain. So by and large, a lot of positive things, and people have done this. So they've done all of these different questionnaires, and in general, so people who follow a plant-based diet, they seem to report a better quality of life. I just want to focus on the environmental domain. Okay, so what does having a vegetarian diet? What does it do? And this is, of course, the perception. But what about objective data in terms of plant-based diets and what it does to the environment? If you ever get time, read this. So this is a fascinating paper that I happened to run across when I was trying to look up a few things. So the Lancet sometimes periodically does this. So it forms these commissions, so where they get together a group of experts to deliberate on a problem. And so this was called the Eat Lancet Commission. So there were about 18 experts across different fields. So some of them were physicians, some of them were nutrition scientists, some of them were they were political scientists, policy, then environment, agriculture, all of these people. And then, so they mainly, this is the problem that they were trying to address. So the overall, the poor diet that we see across the globe, both in terms of undernutrition and overnutrition. So there is both of that happening to a large extent. And the environmental hazards of feeding 10 billion people. So by 2050, that would be the population of the earth. And how do we feed this huge group of people without already compromising all the environmental resources, land, the encroachment on forest space and the biodiversity, and at least the initial parts of this is it's just like how in the Bhagavad Gita, when you start reading it, the first chapter is all about Vishada Yoga. It's about all the Vishada, and that's what this paper also. So it's a very bleak thing about the nature of the problems that we are facing right now. And the goal actually of this commission, and I think overall this is what population is trying to achieve, is this. The UN has articulated this, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the Paris Climate Accord. We want to decrease the global warming to less than 2%. So how do we achieve these twin objectives of ensuring prosperity for everybody in the globe and yet maintaining the temperature low and all of these things? And to cut a long story short, okay, so there are lots of things that they recommend, but one of their strongest recommendations, the number one recommendation, is to increase plant-based foods and decrease the consumption of red meat. They say that it is, even if we completely eliminate carbon fuels and other things, we will still not be able to achieve the Paris Climate Accord without at least a 50% reduction in consumption of red meat. So they strongly advocate this. So I think that it is good for the individual person, but for the planet as such, plant-based foods are probably extremely beneficial. I'm just showing you one very telling piece of data that this paper shows. So this is the environmental effects of food production. So there are various things that they look at. One is the greenhouse gases, so that is being released. So you can see this is all for the same thing, for a serving of meat, a serving of pork, a serving of egg, and a serving of vegetables, and so on. So all the things in green are plant-based, and the red is the animal-based, meat-based. And even without trying to read every single one of them. You can see that it's so striking. So this is like about 1,000 times more. So the amount of greenhouse gases so that is released for making the same amount of ruminant meat compared to vegetables or legumes or cereals. So this is about in the order of this is a logarithmic scale. So, and you can see where this is in terms of greenhouse gases, and that's the same for land use. So the enormous deforestation that is happening so as to grow corn and grow corn only for actually feeding these animals. So this is taking a huge toll on our planet. And then the environmental effect of energy use, and then the acidification potential and something called eutrophication potential. So basically, this has to do with the nitrogen cycling, phosphorus, and so on. So this was fascinating reading. I had never read these things, and I really was, there's so much intricate things that are actually happening. And so um, simple things such as cutting down on animal foods seem to have an enormous impact on this. I don't know how many of you have read this. So Dr. Bijlani, many, many years ago, wrote this article. At that time, I think India had Commonwealth Games. And then so he said that maybe we should probably give plant-based foods to everybody. And that might, India should take a lead in decreasing global warming. And he said this way before this was in fashion. So I've talked a lot about how plant-based diets have shown potential for improving many health outcomes, mainly related to diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, cancer. But they should be combined with other healthy lifestyle practices. It's not just what we eat. It's generally safe, even though I said that we're going to be talking about the risks. Yeah, there are some risks which we need to monitor for, mainly micronutrient deficiencies in vegans. But otherwise, I don't think that it is anything dangerous. And clearly, there are very positive environmental impact. Yeah. Now, once again, this is so, as I said, I'm aware that this is a platform for yoga, education, and spirituality. And I have mostly been talking about uh, about the physical aspect. But again, who can distinguish what is physical and what is spiritual? It's not that they are very different. But what about the role of vegetarianism for spiritual growth? And I don't want to really speak much about it. Okay, it's probably important, but then I think that we should. I mean, it's a given. Everybody knows that most sadhaks probably will opt for plant-based foods, and it is certainly a sattvic food, and it is probably important. But I think we should also be aware of potential risks about it in terms of one is an obsession with a vegetarian diet, only as a way of uh, identifying ourselves as a group. All of these things about like if you have to line up all the go rakshaks and the go bhakshaks, I almost feel that I have a greater kinship with the bhakshaks than the rakshaks. So it's not just a way of eating; it has to be a way of life. And for spiritual progress, I think, yes, it is important, but it can't be the be all and end all. I think we should have I see amongst some vegetarians a great deal of pride. And I don't think there's anything to be proud of being a vegetarian. I think it's very good, but I think we should combine it with a lot of humility. Uh, and I'm trying to convey this. So this is how I'll end. So I just simply copied snippets of a conversation on vegetarianism with Sri Aurobindo. So this is somewhere in the evening talks with Sri Aurobindo in July 1923. Okay. Again, I hope I'm not quoting him out of context or anything, but I think this is um, uh, I think it's very insightful. So the disciple says, I had a long discussion with somebody on vegetarian and non-vegetarian diets. His argument was that those who take non vegetarian diets are people devoid of pity. Life is sacred, and no one who has realized the spirit in all forms of life has the right to take meat. And Sri Aurobindo says, many this is just off the cuff, he's just chatting with them, and he says, many Mohammedans and Christians who take non-vegetarian diet are not devoid of pity. Christ himself was not a vegetarian. Diet has little to do with pity or cruelty. Secondly, the Jains who are probably vegetarians are not less cruel. Your argument, I mean, we have Jain kings who've done all these things. I don't think he's saying bad things about Jains. It's just historical. Your argument that vegetables being lower forms of life can be eaten, but animals being higher forms should not be eaten is based upon an arbitrary assumption about the higher and the lower forms of life. It is a creation of human mind. All life is life. Now, these are things that only somebody like Sri Aurobindo can say. Okay? But I think even for us, I think this is something we need to keep in mind. It is observed to make food such an important thing in the spiritual life. It is a secondary matter whether one takes vegetarian or non-vegetarian diets so far as spiritual life is concerned. So I think it is true, it is important that it's probably a good thing to be eating plant-based foods and to be vegetarian. But I don't think that can be the end of itself. We'll have to go forward beyond that in terms of spiritual progress and also in terms of physical health, as I alluded to. So thank you again very much now for listening to me. If you have any questions, I'll be more than happy to do this.
Thank you so much, Vinay, for this comprehensive educative session. The learnings that we are taking away from today's session, I'm sure it will be helpful to so many. And thanks for closing it on a really interesting note.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
As you said, participants, we can open the Q&A session. If you have anything to ask or share, please go ahead. You can unmute yourself and speak up. Okay, Venkatesh Ji has raised the hand. Please go ahead, sir.
I just wanted to know, sir, are you able to hear me? You want
Yes,
me
yes, I can. Please go ahead.
Yes, yeah. So good evening to you. Thank you to you as well as Bijlani sir and also Arunima. Like my HbA1c is 7.5, the total cholesterol is 218, LDL is 166 and HDL 29. The TSH is 8.73, vitamin D is 15.5, and vitamin B12 is less than 100. So, I just wanted to know because, I try and follow this plant-based diet. So, what else modification I can do? Because, there is also one more thing which I wanted to ask that most of the people who recommend plant-based diet or fruit diet, generally, some people say that you should take vitamin D or vitamin B12 supplement, and some say that you don't take. And generally, when you eat grains like say wheat, rice, etc., you see generally elevated blood sugar levels. So, on those points, I just wanted your feedback. And the last thing I wanted to know that like how many times that one should try and eat. It should be 2 times or 3 times in a day. Should the portion size also be reduced based on the body weight? And how many hours of fasting should be there from the early prior day to the next day, so that you'll be able to take care of the problems?
Well, it's a rather comprehensive list of issues, but then
It's all metabolic. I mean, ultimately it's
yeah,
all
it's all
metabolic, then
metabolic.
eliminating.
So yeah, so the one thing is, yes, should you cut down on portion sizes? Oh, absolutely. Yes, I think that is important. And to cut down on portion sizes, yes, clearly, time restricted eating is a good tool. I don't think that you need to. You can eat 5 times a day, you can eat 1 time a day, you can eat any number of times a day. But as long as you cut down the total amount of food intake, I think that will be helpful. And people have done these studies. So with intermittent fasting, so the weight loss really depends upon the caloric intake. So, and for most people, it's just easier to decrease their caloric intake if they eat for a restricted amount of time. So I think it is really question of what you find most comfortable and that you can adhere to. So yeah, time restricted eating just for 8 hours, 10 hours is a good tool to do that. And Then one of the other things that you asked was, yeah, grains. Yes, it is true that grains will increase your sugars. But then, once again, to quote Dr. Bijlani in one of his previous things, a carbohydrate is known by the company it keeps. So while it is true that refined carbohydrates also will do it, if you eat it with as part of a mixed meal, so with lot of vegetables. So I always tell my patients, so if you eat this much rice and this much sambar, if you change it to a lesser amount of rice and a greater amount of legumes and vegetables, then you will be able to modulate your glucose excursions. So that is important. Regular physical exercise is, of course, critical. There's almost nothing else that will improve your HDL cholesterol. Eating lots of nuts, that is probably a good thing. And then at the end of all of these things, you should do this and then give the devil its due. Many people will still require a medication if your cholesterol is that high, not as an alternative, but as a supplement to healthy lifestyles.
And what about vitamin D and vitamin B12, sir?
Vitamin D, vitamin D, I don't know. Nobody completely understands this. So whether circulating vitamin D levels are good, but if it is clearly very low, yes, then supplementing vitamin D is probably a good idea. B12, yes, if it is that low, and if you are a vegetarian, I think it's a good idea to again increase, to take supplements. So those are simple low-hanging fruits that you could do.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Sure, sir. Yes, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. Participants, anyone else wants to share something or ask something, please go ahead. Dr. Bijlani, sir, would you like to share your thoughts?
Yes, before I make any comments, I have a question for Vinay, and that's about the eggs. Probably there has been some revision because earlier the limit on cholesterol intake was said to be 300 milligrams a day, and one egg has 250 milligrams. So it was thought that if the diet is otherwise vegetarian, which will therefore not have any cholesterol, then one egg per day is permissible, and in many ways it's sort of a convenient way to get high quality protein and a number of vitamins, etc. So it was not strongly discouraged, at least. But then, is there any further revision to encourage even more than one egg, or the limit still stands on the number of eggs per day?
So there is no limit. So the latest, the ATP, the Adult Treatment Panel on Cholesterol, says that dietary cholesterol is not a nutrient of concern. So like they have no recommendations on either restricting. So yes, you're right. Previously, we had the step 2 diet and the step 1 diet. One restricted it to 300 milligrams and the other to 200 milligrams of cholesterol a day, but then not anymore. So people don't believe that eating more eggs, I mean, they don't promote it, but then they also do not have any guidance on restricting dietary cholesterol. And the only food which has only, but we still want to restrict our saturated fat. So we want to decrease the saturated fat to less than 10%. So the only food which does not have saturated fat but cholesterol is eggs. And so I think by and large, this has been interpreted to say that there is no concern about eating more than one egg a day. The studies have shown that people with diabetes seem to have a higher risk of heart disease and strokes with a higher egg intake, whereas the general population probably not.
And what's the percentage of hyper responders in the population in the West? In India, is there some regional or genetic variation?
I don't know whether anybody has done, maybe they haven't, I don't know. I don't know if we know about the prevalence of these hyper responders. We know a little bit of why they are hyper responders. So it's been shown that they have this SNPs, these polymorphisms in a protein called NPC1L1, so which is involved in cholesterol absorption. So they probably have an overactive cholesterol absorption receptor. I don't know if we clearly know what is the prevalence of this across different populations. I'll try to look it up if anybody has reported that.
Apart from these
We
genetic
see that
studies,
clinically also.
uh,
There are some people who go on a keto diet and then their cholesterol goes through the roof. Whereas most others who go on a keto diet, their cholesterol and triglycerides and everything gets better.
now, apart from these genetic studies, is it possible for an individual to find out whether the individual is a hyper responder by experimenting on himself and
Easily.
consuming eggs every day for a month and being off the eggs for a month and seeing the difference or something like that?
Easily. I think it's it. So these are not at all subtle things. Okay, so like if you are a hyper responder, you will see the levels within a month. Oh yes, so I've seen them. Like it really goes through the roof.
And about the saturated fat, again, you pointed out, it should be less than 10%, but at the same time, it should not be zero, isn't it? Because for a long time,
Yes.
at least now the recommendation has been that you should have a mixed fat content about one third saturated, about one third mono, and one third poly, and within poly, an optimum ratio of N6 to N3, rather than the older recommendation that the more unsaturated, the better.
No, that is correct. Yes. Yes, that is very correct. Yes, yes.
Which means a moderate amount of ghee is also not only acceptable, but in fact desirable.
Yes. Yes, that is correct. Yes. Yes. I mean, the part of the problem with some of these studies is, they compare, like, say, all these the studies which have looked at the benefits of high MUFA, monounsaturated fatty. So it was compared with a high carbohydrate diet, and where the carbohydrates are actually coming mainly from a Western diet. So whereas if like when they looked at, say, the Women's Health Initiative study, so where much of the carbs was actually from whole grains, then they didn't really see a benefit in terms of the high fat. And so, I mean, I think while it is important to look at these studies, I think it is important to look at it with a lot of common sense. And I think it makes a lot of common sense that we should get a mixture of foods from different sources. And yes, so getting a bit of saturated fat, a bit of monounsaturated and polyunsaturated is probably better than any extreme diet. So it just doesn't make sense. And I don't think we have data that really looks at what is the optimal.
Any more question, Arunima, in the chat or otherwise?
Can I ask a question? If it's Arvind
Yes,
here.
please.
I was wondering if there is any study of traditional foods. I mean, foods that are traditional in a region, like, for example, the South Indian diet, which is probably over centuries evolved into a certain kind of staple food, like adding imli to sambar and things like that, as opposed to, say, the North Indian diet, which is of a different kind, a different set of spices, minor variations, but a diet which has evolved over centuries and which probably genetically we are more suited to. And there is, I mean, I'm asking this question in the context of I feel an over obsession with the effect of diet on health in modern times, with so much of food processing industries and everything. Somehow, uh, it would be interesting to know if traditional foods, what kind of, but it may be very difficult to do a study of that kind, but is there any data about that? Whether for example, if you take Eskimos, to talk of vegetarian diet to Eskimos doesn't make any sense at all. Or people who are living in the Nordic regions, way up north. So clearly they have over millennia evolved eating fish because they are surrounded with seawater, and So yeah, keeping all this in mind, somehow traditional foods seem to be common sense points to that as the right way of eating. And the effect of modern ways of eating and the food processing and modern food industry's impact on traditional foods seems to be also relevant here to me. Just a thought.
Oh, yeah, and I completely agree with that. And unfortunately, yes, I don't think that we have um, good data for that in terms of whether keeping an isocaloric diet. See, that's the main thing. So we know that caloric restriction is going to be beneficial. So whenever we look at any macronutrient variations, like, whether a high saturated fat, high MUFA, high this, high that, okay? So you will have to compare it across same caloric content. So I don't know whether anybody has done such good studies where a North Indian diet versus a South Indian diet, keeping the same amount of calories, if there is just a tweak of the methods of preparation, the way we spice it, and other things is any different. Again, as you rightly said, I think we'll have to just use a lot of common sense. So if this is a diet that seems good and that has sustained us for lots and lots of generations, so obviously I think there is no reason to be too obsessed and worried about it. Like one of these things is like, say, for instance, coconut and coconut oil. So I know when I was a medical student, that's when all this thing about, oh, saturated fat, cholesterol came out, and people would say, oh, coconut oil, this is why we are all doomed, and so on. We now have some very good studies, actually, which didn't come out of Kerala or anywhere, unfortunately, but actually was again done in the UK. So where they did compared coconut oil with olive oil, supposedly the best of all the oils, and there is absolutely no difference in the lipid profile and in the inflammatory markers. So between this and today in the US, some variant of coconut oil called MCT is medium chain triglycerides. So it is sold as a superfood. It's like the most expensive oil that you can buy is this coconut oil. So yes, I do think so. There is something that has stood the test of time, has done that for a reason, I think.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. Dr. Bijlani, there are no more questions, I think. We look forward to your comments, sir.
Vinay, you started with saying that you are a vegetarian and therefore you may be biased, but then you have proven that you are not biased at all by giving a very balanced account, and in fact, sometimes going to the other extreme of trying to defend even a non-vegetarian diet. So there was no bias at all. And as usual, you also brought in your sense of humor as well as your wide reading and knowledge of the ancient Indian culture. So we could see that also. And about Gandhiji eating meat, again, it was a for a short period under the impression which he picked up from the environment from some of his friends that it will make him strong. But then he has also recounted his experience that when he did that, uh, he felt as if there was a goat bleating in his stomach, and that made him very uncomfortable. So then that's how he gave up again. And when you said that the uh, vegetarian diets or plant-based diets, they should be combined with other lifestyle measures. That, of course, is extremely important because one can't depend upon only one. And the psychological factors being so important, if one is obsessed with any particular diet, that itself can be a source of stress. Or if a person is taking a healthy diet but is actually finding it very unpalatable, doesn't have that self control to eat that diet happily, then again, it may do more harm than good. So these are some of the things that are important. So uh, it's not only what we eat, but how much we eat and how we eat. All these things matter. And total quantity, as you have emphasized, is extremely important because no matter what we eat, if we are eating too much of it and it's more than we need, then we'll put on weight, and that will be the most harmful that more harmful than any other subtle changes in the diet that we are trying to make. And how we eat, again, eating with in a spirit of gratitude and with the idea that the food is primarily meant to sustain us, to give us the energy for doing what we are here to do in this world. That helps in getting the most out of food, and also uh, uh, avoiding any of the harmful effects which may be there. Uh, Here, often Tara Didi talks about the Pondicherry ashram, and she says that uh, there were times in the ashram when there was not much money, and therefore there were very few items in the diet. And if we compare that with the type of obsession we have today about what all the diet should have, that was probably a poor diet. But then everybody was so strong and healthy, and nothing seemed to matter. Nobody thought much about what all we should eat. It was just that if you had enough to eat and your tummy was full, you thought that it was okay. So, uh, with that attitude, if you have that attitude, then probably you can get away with quite a bit of irregularities, which now sometimes we have become a little over conscious about. So these are some of the things, which balance, which bring in a sense of balance in whatever we do. And that is probably the most important thing. Moderation or balance. It's extremely important in whatever lifestyle changes we make. Instead of getting obsessed with just a few limited things and then going into minute details. Because over-analysis and using too much of the mental part of the being, so that because that appears very appealing, because one can go into details and appear as if one is extremely clear and has detailed knowledge. But that much detail and that much intellectualizing actually on the spiritual path becomes a hindrance rather than a help. It seems extremely clear, but that is the type of clarity which actually uh, clouds the deeper reality. So that with these few things, I thought I'll add another dose of balance, which you emphasized so much, rather than an obsession. But at the same time, all the scientific data that you presented puts things in the proper perspective. So thank you again for a very balanced and scholarly talk, balanced in every way. It had scholarship, it had deep wisdom, and also uh, the spiritual element, and the uh, and the uh, other aspects of culture and the families and the ethnic considerations. All these things were there. There was hardly anything missing in the talk that you gave.
Thank you, Dr. Bijlani. I must have had some good teachers.
Yes, I'm sure. And I was only one of the several teachers you had. What happened to your camera today?
I do not know. Are you not able to see? That's
No,
what I asked. Why is
we've not
that?
been able to see you.
It is on. It says stop. I don't know why. Blur my background.
I think it's excessive security, because sometimes they ask you that somebody is asking to use your camera. Do you allow? And then even if you allow, still it tries to be on the safe side and does not actually show you. It has happened to me also occasionally.
Maybe you're right.
Thank you, Dr. Bijlani, for your comments. Before closing today's session, I would like to inform that the recording of today's session and all Yes Talks are published on our YouTube channel, Yes Spirituality. Please do visit the YouTube channel for extensive content on yoga, education, spirituality, and related subjects like self-help, psychology, and wellness. Vinay sir, thanks so much once again for sparing your valuable time for all of us.
Thank you. This is a privilege. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Participants, we thank you as well for being with us today. We'll close today's session now with a moment of peaceful silence. Namaste.
Namaste.